Hello, one and all. Welcome to another episode of the MMA Vision Analysis. This one, I'm here to talk about Khamzat Chimaev's recent comments in regards to his unfinished business with Sean Strickland, former middleweight champion. And it's this perfect time for this kind of thing because both of these guys are potential title contenders. But before getting started, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that notification to get all of this that is new from this channel, your channel, the one and only MMA Vision Analysis. Khamzat Chimaev, the wild horse of the UFC. Yes, I said it. He is the wild horse of the UFC. Because if he is not the wild horse, if he's not the Mustang, then who is? This is exactly why he's a captivating figure. This is entertainment at the end of the day. And when it comes to Khamzat Chimaev, he is most definitely one of the most entertaining fighters. I don't think this is just a personal opinion. This is a factual statement. All you have to do is go back and watch some of his fights. They're all fascinating, entertaining, back and forth wars, at least as the UFC is concerned. If I'm not mistaken, recently Khamzat Chimaev was rated as the most overrated fighter. I'm not sure how people were able to come up with this kind of conclusion. I think there is a lot of I don't want to say hate, but he is definitely a hate or love him type of character. There is nothing in between with Khamzat Chimaev. Me personally, I don't really take much of their personal life personal. I just like that style of fighting. The wild, move mountains kind of style. And that's exactly why this is the entertainment business first and foremost. We have to understand that. And with a guy like Khamzat Chimaev, it's going to be entertaining whether you hate him or love him. I think sometimes people answer an easier question instead of the question that's actually being asked. I don't think the question was for these surveys, do you hate or love Khamzat Chimaev? It's, do you find the guy overrated? How is Khamzat Chimaev overrated? Guys, please stop and think about that. How is this guy overrated? 7 in a row in the UFC, if I'm not mistaken. First, 4 or 5 fights, he was just blowing through guys during the first part of this decade, the earlier parts of this decade. We all remember this guy was bringing us entertainment when there was none. He was fighting when it was pretty much, there was no other sport that was taking place other than the UFC. I think WWE were hosting events. Soccer was hosting events later on. But it was at a time where sports had halted. This guy was giving us pure entertainment. He was fighting in weeks' notice, back-to-back fights, finishing guys in most spectacular fashion. How is Khamzat Chimaev overrated? Come on. That is just, it's like these Rotten Tomatoes reviews. Sometimes you have to take these things with a grain of salt sometimes. With all respect to everyone's opinion here, but Khamzat Chimaev is one of the most entertaining fighters in the UFC. And a matter of fact, I label him the Mustang, the wild horse of the UFC. This guy's ready to throw down outside of the octagon. I don't condone violence outside of the octagon. I like controlled violence. It's a sport. There is no hate. There's no animosity towards one another inside of the octagon. But it's controlled kind of violence. Beautiful artistic violence. Okay, let's just talk about it like that. When it comes to Khamzat Chimaev, he's one of the best in the business. I really thought that there was no argument in that regard, but apparently sometimes people think otherwise. But I think it's a hate him or love him thing. People answer a different question rather than a question that's actually being asked. People were not asked, do you hate or love Khamzat Chimaev, yes or no? The question was, do you find him overrated? I don't see how Khamzat Chimaev is overrated, to be honest. Going back to the subject at hand, I do digress a bit. Khamzat Chimaev a couple days ago talked about him being ready for a title shot as soon as he comes back. Obviously, that was dismissed as laughable by some sources. Me personally, I do not have a problem with Khamzat Chimaev being given a title shot. I do understand that it's a bit unfair, but sometimes you just have to look at the circumstances at hand. Because if you have a Whitaker fighting Strickland, and Khamzat Chimaev is not going to be ready to fight anytime soon, and he can only fight overseas, so it only makes sense for Strickland to fight Whitaker. Winner of that fight fights Khamzat Chimaev, perhaps. Let's wait and see what happens in that regard. But here, I'm talking about the quote-unquote unfinished business between Khamzat Chimaev and former middleweight champion Sean Strickland. Apparently, these two had some wars inside of the gym, behind scenes, and Khamzat Chimaev seems to think that there's some unfinished business between the two. I love it when guys are excited to fight each other. You don't want guys to go in there cautious to fight one another. And when you think about caution, you don't think of Khamzat Chimaev or Sean Strickland. Those two, I don't think they understand what caution means in terms of in fighting sense, that is. Would this be an entertaining fight? Absolutely. These guys, if you put these guys inside of the octagon, it's, I don't want to say promise to knock out, but, and I hate making knockout predictions, but I'm pretty certain this one would end in a knockout. Because both of these guys, quite frankly, are wild horses. Both of them are Mustangs of the UFC. Wild styles. And if these two were to collide inside of the octagon, it would make for a heck of a main event. I mean, one for the ages, really. Just think about it. But we cannot forget Robert Whitaker in all the mix. We have to understand that Robert Whitaker is probably more than likely next up for Sean Strickland. Unfortunately for Strickland, Strickland did express his disinterest in fighting Whitaker. I don't blame him. That Whitaker fight is no joke. Former middleweight champion Robert Whitaker is a clinical finisher. If you don't believe me, just look at his last performance. One, it's interesting to see what happens for Chimaev moving forward. Maybe he will get a direct title shot. I don't know. But I would not be opposed to seeing Khamzat Chimaev, Sean Strickland, to determine the number one contender for that middleweight title. But then what do you do with Whitaker? What do you do with Whitaker? That's the real question here. So is it realistic for Chimaev to fight Strickland? If we were to logically think about it, I would have to immediately answer no. First of all, I think I would assume that Chimaev is still in recovery mode. One. Two, I think it's been confirmed at this point that the guy has visa issues, okay? Cannot enter the States. If I'm not mistaken, that's most certainly the case with Chimaev. So you have to wait on some kind of Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, Middle East card, just generally speaking. Two, and I do understand, I have to be honest, I just feel like it's a pain for the UFC to put those together. But I feel as if the UFC is kind of forced to put those together just because of the enormous amount of talent that's coming out of that part of the world. You can say Russia, Dagestan, Chechnya, you name it. however you want to name it, or just Europe in general. There's an enormous amount of talent, and it would make sense for the UFC to host events in places like the Middle East. Very suitable in terms of infrastructure. Fantastic 101. Second to none, in all honesty, in terms of infrastructure. But in terms of travel, for some of these guys, 13, 14, 15 hours, that is a long time. That's a long time to be traveling. I do understand that it's vice versa. That's always the case as well. But the sport is global, and we have to view it from a global standpoint. And that's precisely what the UFC is doing. And it's only growing in that regard. Matter of fact, it's only going to get better and easier to put together these events. But I do understand for a guy like Strickland to travel 13, 14 hours to fight like a guy like Whitaker, it's just not strategically. You would have to go out probably a good month in advance. And even Chimaev himself, if I'm not mistaken, he's relocated to the Caucasus Mountains, or let's say mountains of Dagestan, if I'm not mistaken, to train at the higher altitude, because apparently the weather down in the Middle East, Dubai specifically speaking, the hot, dry desert heat, it wasn't suiting Chimaev that much, and that's why he had illnesses allegedly. So it's not even suiting Chimaev. But for a guy like Strickland, you'd have to go out weeks, perhaps even months in advance, just to adapt to the weather, change of time, all of that stuff. I just find that to be inconvenient. And quite frankly, I don't see why Strickland has to do that. I do not think that Strickland would be interested in doing such thing. So realistically speaking, is it possible for Chimaev, Strickland to face one another? There's nothing that's impossible. I think we all agree on that one. But in terms of logistics, it's a pain for the UFC to make this fight happen. And quite frankly, it does not make sense for this fight to happen at this time, because we have Chimaev, who's still in recovery mode, cannot enter the States, can only fight in the Middle East, and more than likely Strickland is probably going to face Whitaker, probably on the same card as that is Adesanya Dricus fight. Who knows? That just seems to be the case. But would I be in favor of a Strickland Chimaev fight? Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. That is a fight for the ages, as I said earlier. If you made it this far, I appreciate you for sticking around. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and subscribe for more.